Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is a quick interview reference notes on API automation. Okay, so here we have discussed about the API testing fundamentals and also about the REST assured API automation concepts at very high level. Okay, so what is an API? An API allows two software systems to communicate with each other. Okay, for example, a mobile app calls API from the backend server. Similarly, front-end UI calls API from the database via backend. Okay. Next, we have talked about what is API testing, and we have talked about why API testing is important. Okay, and we have talked about the types of APIs, and we have talked about the REST principles to be followed. Okay. I have tried to mention everything in a single liner. Okay, so and then we have talked about the HTTP methods, and then we have talked about the difference between put and patch, and we have talked about the idempotent methods and the difference between idempotent and non-idempotent. What what are the different status codes and difference between 401 and 403 headers in API. We have talked about the content type versus accept, and then we have talked about the some other common content types, and we have talked about the different authentication types like basic authentication, bearer authentication, OAuth 2.0 and API key, and we have talked about the JWT token, JSON web token. Okay, and we have talked about the API request components, and we have talked about the query parameter versus path parameter. We have talked about the request body types, and we have talked about the JSON and the JSON data types and the difference between JSON object versus JSON array. We have talked about the API testing scenarios, and then we have talked about the important API validations. We have talked about the schema validation and what is contract testing, what is serialization, what is deserialization. Okay, guys, I have specified a detailed notes in my interview preparation kit. There you can find all the code samples and other details. Okay, yeah, I just tried to mention what exactly it is. That's all. Okay, so for quick reference. So that is the reason you are seeing only one liner or two liner answer for all the questions. Okay, so for detailed notes, please do check out for the link in the description and also in the comment section. Okay, let's get started. And then we have talked about the Pojo class, and in the rest assured we have talked about what is a rest assured, why we prefer rest assured, and then basic rest assured architecture, and then we have talked about the BDD style in rest assured, and then we have talked about the HTTP methods which rest assured supports and the common rest assured methods, and then how to send the reports, how to send the query parameters, how to send the path parameters, how to validate the response, and we have talked about the Amcrest matches, and then we have talked about the JSON path, and we have talked about the difference between JSON path and XPath. We have talked about the response extraction. We have talked about the request specification and response specification. We have talked about the base URI versus base path difference. We have talked about the serialization example. We have talked about the deserialization example. And then we have talked about the file upload in rest assured. And then we have talked about the file download in validation. We have talked about the cookies in API, and we have talked about the session handling, and then OAuth 2 or OAuth 2.0, and then we have talked about the basic authentication example. We have talked about the logging in rest assured and response time validation, schema validation, and we have talked about the testng and testng annotations, and we have talked about the data provider. We have talked about the API chaining. We have talked about the CRUD operations. We have talked about the API versioning. We have talked about the pagination. We have talked about the rate limiting. We have talked about the mocking APIs. We have talked about the API testing tools. We have talked about the Swagger or OpenAI. We have talked about the Postman versus Rest Assured. We have talked about the SOAP versus REST. And we have talked about the Rest Assured framework architecture. Okay, what are the different types of layers, utilities it contains. And we have talked about the Maven. And we have talked about the important life cycles of Maven. We have talked about the common dependencies. We have talked about the Jackson versus JSON. We have talked about the CI/CD integration. We have talked about the parallel execution. We have talked about the environment management. And then we have talked about the sensitive data handling. We have talked about the retry mechanism. And we have talked about on how to validate the dynamic response data. We have talked about on how to handle token expiration. We have talked about on how to handle environment switching. We have talked about on how to validate nested JSON, about API security testing concepts, performance testing basics, and difference between API testing and UI testing, difference between smoke versus sanity versus regression, and then what happens internally when API request is sent, what's the difference between monolithic and microservices APIs, API automation best practices to be followed, what are the common real-time API challenges, what are the most asked in the next section we have discussed about the most asked rest assured interview questions, explain the given when then format, how do you perform serialization, how do you perform API chaining, how do you validate schema, how do you manage reusable components. Okay, and we have talked about the filters in rest assured, interceptors, and we have talked about the SSL validation, proxy configuration, connection timeout handling benefits. Okay, and then this is the common framework structure in real time, and the database validation in API testing. And we have talked about assertion in API testing, like what are the parameters we consider for assertions. We have talked about the difference between soft assert versus hard assert, common defects found in APIs, difference between HTTP and HTTPS, and we have talked about the caching, and we have talked about CORS, about API lifecycle, and that's all, guys. Okay, so these are the interview preparation strategy that you need to focus on these topics while preparing for the interview, and these are the coding areas interviewer might ask you to write a sample code on these parameters. Okay, and then some of the questions for the senior level questions, like how do you design an API framework, how do you improve the API automation stability. Important keywords for interviews are stateless, idempotent, serialization, deserialization, JSON schema, and many other. Okay, OAuth2, JWT, API chaining, request and response specification, AMCRUS matches, POJO, contract testing, microservices. Okay, yeah, that's all, guys. So this is at very high level documentation. I have uploaded multiple rest assured API automation documents in the interview preparation kit, where you can find detailed answers for all the questions along with code samples. Okay, and also I have uploaded frequently asked interview questions and answers. So please do check out and let me know if you have any queries or questions. Thank you so much for watching my video. All the best for your upcoming interview. Stay tuned for more updates. Yeah. Happy learning, happy testing.